Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And so we've come to our final keynote speech of the conference. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Praveetha Patalay, who is a lecturer in population mental health and child development at the Institute of Psychology, Health and Society at the University of Liverpool. Her research focuses on using longitudinal studies to explore school-aged children's mental health. And so I introduce Dr. Praveetha Patalay.
Hello, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel like I'm very loud at the moment. I have to sort of mute this a little bit. Okay, today I'm going to speak about the mental health of school-aged children, drawing on not just longitudinal studies, but also several large school-based data sets. So I think the common characteristic of the data sets are that they're large. Some of them are longitudinal, some of them aren't. So just to talk through what I hope to cover today, I will talk about young people's mental health today, or focusing first on mental ill health, the prevalence and how it develops through childhood and adolescence, touch upon are problems increasing and present data to that effect, and specifically look at an example where we explore the effect of developing symptoms longitudinally on education attainment. And the reason I chose the example to be focusing on education attainment, I can explain a little bit later, but also it was due to sort of the motivation for that particular study, which is lots of times in the era of Ofsted and everything, when schools sort of want empirical evidence for the need to sort of support mental ill health. I think it's nice to have big data sets that provide this evidence. Then I will talk about risk and protective factors and try to situate this a little bit in the school, but also thinking about, ecological theory, and I know this has been mentioned throughout the conference, and then focus in on mental ill health and mental well-being of young people and how they might be similar or different. The sort of key commonality between all of the data I will present is there are a large population of school-based data sets, as I already said, but also very key is they're all very recent data sets. So they're all data from the last few years. And I think this is very important because lots of the prevalence data and things we've had has been from a long time ago. And I think lots of you will recognize just from your practice that we hear reports about it being more problems now than ever before. And it's, I think, nice to think about the data of today as well as being relevant for, if we're trying to understand how to help children and what the risk and protective factors are, looking at data from the early 90s is not going to be as helpful as looking at data from today and this generation. So as all of you are aware, mental ill health is a problem, and it's increasingly in the last year probably a problem that has received more media and sort of common attention than normally has been the case for many years. So lots of headlines about a quarter of 14-year-olds having signs of depression, teachers and heads warning over pupils' untreated mental health issues. This one I think is very interesting because it's a cross-national study that shows that UK adolescents are doing particularly badly compared to lots of other developed countries. And lots of media attention on this, including a Guardian editorial and a series of papers on children's mental health and it not being an optional extra. And at the same time as we see all of this, we have the green paper that was published last month. It's a consultative document. And again, it says lots of things that probably people who've practiced and done research in this area have known for a long time. But it's really nice for there to be a green paper on children's mental health. So win on one side, although on the other hand, they're cutting services and funds. So, you win some, you lose some. But I think in terms of this, again, it's a really nice opportunity to think about there is probably interest more now than ever before on trying to do something, even from policymakers and government, and how do we influence this. And I think data has a really important role to play in this conversation. So I'm first going to quickly touch upon two very recent reports about prevalence and trends across childhood. The first one is called Mental Ill Health Among Children of the New Century. It is using data from the Millennium Cohort study. For those of you not familiar with this cohort, It's a cohort of 18,000 odd children born at the start of this millennium across the UK, so it's nationally representative cohort, and they've been followed throughout their childhood, so at ages 9 months, 3 years, 5, 7, 11, 14, this sweep, and now we're in the field collecting data from young people when they're 17. And we have very rich data from their families. We know about their schools. We have teacher reports and physical assessments, cognitive assessment, medical assessments, and so on. So it's very, very rich interdisciplinary data. Lots of researchers use it, and I use it to do mental health research. This other report here, Mental Health Problems in 11 to 14-year-olds, results from the first Head Start annual survey we published yesterday. So it's very, very recent. And this is from data, most of you will probably be familiar with the Head Start program. Along with the sort of funding that has gone into Head Start, there's also a learning program or research program that goes alongside it. And from the first baseline survey of 30,000 school children in secondary schools, we released some sort of prevalence findings yesterday, which I'll also talk about. So looking at the Millennium Cohort study, the most striking findings at age 14 were based on self-reported depressive symptoms at 14. And what we found is that 24% of 14-year-old girls and 9% of boys, so 1 in 4 girls almost and 1 in 4 boys reported high levels of depressive symptoms. And this is based on a very well-established sort of clinical depression scale. It's not a clinical diagnosis. However, being above this clinical threshold it's a well-validated clinical threshold. So we just didn't come up with what is high depressive symptoms. We used a validated scale and it's a very high number. I mean, intuitively sounds like a high number, but I'll show you comparative data to sort of stress that point. And this equates just in this generation that was born in 2000, 2001. So today's, 14, 15-year-olds, when they answered that survey, today's 17-year-olds, 16, 17-year-olds, it equates to 67,000 boys and 166,000 girls nationally. And I think the reason it's worth sometimes putting numbers to these things, that is an enormous number. This is just in a cohort born in 2 years. And it's also sometimes important to put a number to these things because when we release these numbers, the Department of Health or NHS England came back saying, yeah, but we're increasing numbers, and next year there'll be, I think it was 20,000 children who will be able to be seen by CAMS. We were sort of like, yes, but 20,000 is hardly touching it. But anyway, but I think that's why it's useful sometimes to have numbers. So thinking about this data set, it's also a powerful data set because we can look through childhood. And we look at emotional problems and behavioral problems or internalizing and externalizing, whatever you might want to call it. And here we have development through childhood. You can see 3, 5, 7, 11, 14. And I've split it by gender because in this particular result, the gender difference is interesting. So you see for emotional problems, the children who meet the threshold for high emotional problems through childhood, throughout childhood until the end of primary school, the levels of girls and boys reporting these problems are very similar. And then between 11 and 14, you see a real hike in the numbers of girls experiencing emotional problems, but the numbers of boys stay fairly similar in this window. And so it really highlights the sort of specific vulnerability that girls seem to have between those ages. And in contrast with behavioral problems, so the developmental trajectory is interesting. So you have the high problems in early childhood that sort of go down into middle childhood and then start increasing again. But at every age, consistently, boys have higher problems than girls, or more boys have behavioral problems than girls. And that sort of differential stays pretty much the same across. So looking at the reports from yesterday, so the Head Start study, and the findings here mirror the findings from Millennium Cohort really quite consistently. So in terms of just overall, from the 30,000 children, around 18.5% met the sort of high clinical threshold for emotional difficulties. And when you look at it by gender, more females than males. And when you look at it by age, more children in year 9 than in year 7. And similarly, for behavioral difficulties, it was quite high again, 18%. The sort of overall difficulty levels were very similar for both problems. But here we have more boys than girls. And again, problems increase from year 7 to year 9. So the question, whenever we've talked about this, whether it was to the media, whether it is to researchers or policymakers, the first question they always ask is, but is this just what it's always been? Teenagers are likely to feel down, and that's just part of being a teenager. Maybe that's just always been the case. And it hasn't always been the case. So I'll present two pieces of evidence for this. So the first is a study we did where we compared two cross-sectional studies, large school-based data sets, which were the baselines to two different RCTs. There were students from year 7 and 8, and thousands of students in schools just in England, so this is not nationally representative. And we see that in 2009 and 2014, emotional problems above threshold, the levels stay fairly similar for boys. There's no significant difference. But in girls, just in these 5 years, and controlling for everything else about these individuals, so their age, deprivation, and special education needs, and so on, the proportion of girls above the threshold increased from 13% to 20% in 5 years. That's a 50% increase in 5 years. And if that could have just been one random sort of finding from one data set and just could be a glitch, but it's not, and this is findings from the MCS cohort, which is 2000-2001 born, to the ALSPAC cohort, which is another British cohort, which was born exactly 10 years earlier. So comparing today's teenagers to sort of a generation of teenagers 10 years older than them, using exactly the same measure at exactly the same age. So stress is at age 14, the same measure, the same threshold. You see that the problems, so the prevalence for girls for the ALSPAC cohort was 12.5%, and in the MCS it's 24%, and the prevalence for boys was 5.5%, and now it's 9%. So that is in 10 years, one generation, same measure, same age. We see an almost doubling in girls and a substantial increase in prevalence in boys. So I'll move on now to why, or an example of how changes in behavioral and emotional problems impacts on children's capacity to learn and their academic attainment scores. Just for the example, it'll be externalizing symptoms, but we've done similar analysis with internalizing symptoms as well, and the results are very similar. So this data set was quite interesting because we had a large data set from hundreds of schools collected at 3 time points. So in years 4, 5, and 6. And this data set was linked to the national pupil data set. So then we had the key stage scores from proper standardized tests. So we had key stage 1, and then you have 3 years of data, and then you have key stage 2. And the question really was, what happens, how can we study change in scores and look at what happens in the middle to see whether that affects the change in scores? And this is sort of more, not interesting, but more informative than just looking at associations, because we already know behavioral problems and emotional problems associated with lower academic attainment, but you could argue in these cases that that is due to other shared risk factors such as deprivation or other things. So so when you look at change in something related to change in something else, you get one step closer to trying understanding sort of mechanisms and causality. So here, to try and capture change in externalizing symptoms in a sensible way, because lots of the literature was very inconclusive around this area, because they just sort of took a mean score of what happens in the middle and then didn't find anything. So the literature was starting to conclude that behavioral problems don't affect change in attainment, that they just affect just sort of where you start. And it wasn't a very convincing argument. So the approach we took here in this particular paper was to, instead of just lumping everybody, we sort of identified groups of children based on the type of development they had in behavioral symptoms in these 3 years. So here we see a group of, I can't get the pointer to point, but you can see there's a large group of children at the bottom who's the majority group, who have no symptoms in the beginning but don't have symptoms throughout. But then you have all these other groups. So you have groups of children who started with high symptoms but are improving. You have groups of children who started with low symptoms that are sort of deteriorating over the 3 years, some deteriorating more than others. So you have a group that goes from low to very high, and then you have a group that goes from low to sort of moderately high. And to be able to unpack this heterogeneity sort of allows you to then say, okay, so what happens to these different groups of children in terms of their change in scores? And what we find is that the group that increases, so if you actually develop problems in these years, it has the most negative impact on your key stage scores, and that's an entire key stage score point. So it has a really quite significant impact in terms of even sort of thinking of effect sizes on change. And lots of the other groups do as well. So even the group that sort of improves compared to the group that has never had problems still does a little bit worse. But it's quite sort of striking that the groups that either have very high problems throughout or sort of develop problems have the most negative impact on their change in key stage score. So they really have, there's a negative impact on their sort of attainment. And it also, we sort of did lots of analysis. We also worked out why all the other studies didn't find this, because essentially, you can, just going back to the previous slide, it's the children who are getting better and the children who are getting worse, who if you just do an average, just sort of cancel each other out, and then it looks like nothing, behavioral problems don't affect attainment at all. So by separating these out, you can sort of start to understand that, okay, different children with different developmental patterns have different developmental outcomes. So I'll move on to risk and protective factors. So in terms of thinking about risk and protective factors, just in terms of background, I think in this context of schools and sort of supporting children's mental health in schools, we really have to think about, because when we do research in population-based mental health, we put lots of things into our models, and some of them are non-malleable factors. Some of them are things that we would like them to be malleable, but are not as easily malleable in the school setting. And then there are other factors that are probably much more easily malleable in the school setting. And just to give examples, for example, non-malleable factors would be sex and ethnicity. You know, you sort of can't change those most of the time. And then you have the less or not easily malleable factors. So the sort of broader things such as income inequalities, like we know these affect children's well-being and mental health, and it'd be nice if we could do things about it. But in terms of our everyday practice, that's more difficult. And school composition as well, depending on where your school is, your school, you know, the mix of students you have in your school is sort of what you have. And then you have the malleable factors in the school context, such as school climate and available social support. So through the rest of my when I look at risk and protective factors, I'll try to pull out the findings around the malleable factors in the school context, because that's relevant to today. And just to give an example for how some of these behave in our data. So in the Millennium Cohort study, for example, to think of a completely non-malleable factor such as sex, at age 11, both for mental well-being and mental ill health, there is absolutely no sex difference, as I showed you before, for like depressive symptoms. And however, by age 14, both in well-being and mental ill health, girls are doing poorer than boys. So there's really significant large sex differences that emerge. This is differences in prevalence in the Millennium Cohort based on family income. So you can see, especially in girls, so girls in blue and boys in red. At this particular age, we didn't see a very clear gradient in boys' mental health problems, but in girls, you see, except for the lowest quintile, and there's this really clear gradient where the richest 20% of children have much less problems compared to any other group. And even in the boys, overall, children from the richest families have the least prevalence of problems compared to any other group. So then that's an example of sort of semi-malleable factor. And looking at the data from yesterday, and the reason I put this from the report, this is the Head Start data, was because lots of the data here is from the National Pupil Database. So it's things that schools collect regularly. That's how we got this data. So it's quite also interesting to see from school-based, regularly collected data what we can tell about the risk for mental health problems. So here we have Everything in the pinky bit is suggesting increased odds, so more likely to have problems, and everything in the blue bit is reduced odds. And you can see there's some differences, as we already discussed, by gender. This is for behavioral problems, so females are less likely than males to experience behavioral problems. And then we have some other differences by ethnicity. For example, children from Asian children were less likely to have behavioral problems, and Chinese children as well. And then we have an age effect where children in year 9 are more likely than year 7. And then we have this expected sort of association of special educational needs, free school meal eligibility, child in need. So moving on to something regarding sort of school factors. So this is a study we did in 648 primary schools. It was data from 23,000 children. It's not a longitudinal study, so it's one cross-section of 23,000 children. But it's quite a powerful data set because we have individual level, quite a lot of detail about the individuals, but we also have quite a lot of detail about the schools. So we looked at different variables that predict, in this particular study, we looked at different variables that predict bullying. However, this very similar analysis for mental ill health and well-being, I'm just finishing at the moment. And there's some results that are similar and there's some that are different. But just to sort of talk through what we find, in terms of the school level factors, so you have things like school size, gender balance, proportion of children with free school meals, proportion of children from an ethnic minority group. So these are sort of school level factors that are not so malleable. And we see that the impact of these factors on whether children bully or not is actually very, very small. And most of them are completely insignificant, even in the 23,000 children. And school climate, which was measured from children's report of feeling connected to the school, has a very large, so higher school climate predicted much lower probabilities of bullying. And these two, so school level deprivation and school climate, were the only two that were statistically significant, even in those many children. So suggesting that these two are really only two things that predict bullying behavior in primary schools. And it's a very complicated number, so I didn't I was trying to avoid numbers as much as I could. But we also looked at the interaction between children's characteristics and the school characteristics and how that predicted bullying. And we found some really interesting patterns with deprivation and school climate, especially with deprivation where children from more deprived backgrounds had a different likelihood of bullying based on the sort of school climate and deprivation composition of their schools. So there's this also thing about how children are different from their schools, or how much similar they are to their school population that affects their likelihood of bullying. So moving on to mental ill health and well-being. And given well-being as a sort of theme of this conference, I think this fits, but it's trying to think specifically about what we mean when we say mental health. And for the most part, when we say mental health, most of us at least mean mental ill health. But really, when we say mental health is more than just about illness. So even just thinking about health, we have the definition of health by the World Health Organization, which has been the definition of health since 1946. And the definition quite clearly states that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Clearly highlighting that even when we talk about mental health, really, it's not just about mental ill health, it's also about mental well-being. And I think this sort of quite nicely illustrates what happens in the population. So you have symptoms, and there's a normal distribution of symptoms. And when we talk about mental ill health, we're only really talking about the 10 or 20% at this end of the spectrum. However, in the school context, we really have everyone in that distribution. And so in the school context, as different from the sort of CAMS context, it will be important to think about the whole distribution and not just the 20% on this end. And although I think there's data from, I'm not presenting this data today, but there's evidence that shows that, like most of us researchers, CAMS, clinicians, even in schools, reactivity is more prevalent than sort of prevention and promotion. So most of the time, we wait for children to sort of exhibit serious levels of problems before something is done about it. And another thing that is problematic about this sort of model is that it assumes that well-being or flourishing or having a good quality of life is the other end of the spectrum from mental ill health. However, that's not what the data tell us. So this is data from almost 50,000 children, 48,000 something, from, I don't remember how many hundreds of schools, but 8 to 13-year-olds from England. And what we looked at in this paper was whether mental ill health and well-being, and this was all, we had both variables in the measured, reported by the child, were actually associated on one spectrum or not. And if we think about the top 20% of children with high well-being and the bottom 20% of children with the lowest well-being, and look at how they're distributed across this mental ill health spectrum, so in terms of symptomology and psychopathology, what we find, surprisingly, is this. So there are children, and actually quite a significant amount of children, who have very high quality, report very high quality of life and well-being. So they say they're happy with their lives, they find meaning in their lives, they like their family and friends. But at the same time, they also have high levels of symptoms. And then this is the expected trajectory. You expect children with low well-being to have high mental health problems and with high well-being to have low symptoms. But this trajectory is very interesting because it suggests that actually what we could be doing is focusing on how children with mental ill health problems can move to that quartile. So we may not be able to cure all the problems, but should the aim be to improve, to give them the resources to improve their well-being and quality of life and resilience, to make them feel like there are things about their life that they like. So the question from that paper that sort of struck us was, are the risk and protective factors, so this was just distributions, but then I was thinking, okay, so if these are not two sides of the same spectrum, then the same things will not be associated with both of them. So the question was, are the risk and protective factors of mental ill health and well-being the same? And for this, we looked at a whole range of risk and protective factors in the Millennium Cohort study through childhood, and the outcome being at age 11, so mental ill health and well-being at age 11. And the types of risk factors we looked at included individual level factors, which include things like socio-demographic things, but also children's cognitive ability, health status, weight, family factors, including things like the family composition, family sort of disruption, family socioeconomic status, but also things like the child-parent relationship and parents' relationship with each other. Socioeconomic circumstances, so we have family income, parent education, but also perceived socioeconomic status. So we had data from the children about whether they felt richer, poor, or similar to most of their friends. And then school environment, neighborhood environment, and sort of national differences, focusing on things like liking their school, school connectedness. With neighborhood, we had variables on neighborhood safety, so the children's perceptions of their neighborhood as being safe places. We had home safety. So there's quite a lot of more broader variables we included in these models. What we found. So I will explain this infographic, this particular one, in a little bit of detail, and then the next few will make sense more easily, hopefully. So we have individual characteristics in blue, like in the previous picture, family, relationships, and home life in red, socioeconomic circumstances in green, and the wider school and neighborhood environment in purple. And these are the factors that were associated with well-being at age 11. So these are only the ones that were statistically significant, so we had loads more that we sort of investigated, and the size of the circle tells you how large the effect was. And if it has a white ring around it, it's a protective factor, so the effect was in a positive direction. And if it has a black ring around it, it was a risk factor, so the association is in a negative direction. So as we can see, the first thing that strikes us from this is there's very little blue. So very few individual characteristics at age 11 predict differences in children's well-being. Cognitive ability doesn't. Chronic illness doesn't. So even children with serious chronic illnesses like diabetes and asthma and stuff, I say that their sort of well-being and quality of life reports are not different from their peers. And there's lots of red. So things about being bullied by peers, bullied by siblings, arguing with their friends, arguing with their parents. All of these things were risk factors for well-being. And positive things like spending time with friends outside of school was a protective factor. And then you have the things in green. So this perceived socioeconomic status, even at age 11, children feeling like they were richer or poorer than their friends negatively impacted on their well-being. And this was a really striking finding, because we have these findings from adult literature. So perceived inequalities in adults makes us feel not so, like our well-being is reduced when we feel richer or poorer than our friends or family or most people we know. But to see this effect at age 11 was quite striking. And nobody's ever documented this before, so it was quite like, oh. And then for family income and well-being at this particular age, we didn't see the expected effect. Actually, we saw no effect at all. And then after we control for cognitive ability and these other factors, we see a reverse effect where high family income was associated as a risk factor for self-reported well-being at age 11. And this is well-being, though. This is not mental ill health. So, and that's where that'll be one of the key differences we find. And then we have liking school and engaged with school being really key protective factors at this age. So there's some of the biggest circles in that circle. So they're really highly associated with well-being at this age, controlling for everything else. And the neighborhood safety was the same. In this particular case, it's coded as feeling unsafe, so it's a risk factor. So children feeling safe in their neighborhood really impacted on their well-being, or was associated highly with their well-being. It's not causal.
Sorry, could I just clarify?
Yes.
The perception that their family was richer than their friends was a risk factor?
Was a risk factor, yes. So if they perceived themselves to be richer or poorer, they had poorer well-being than...
Richer or poorer?
Yeah, than if they said they were the same. So
different.
Yeah, so being different, yeah. The effect was much higher for the richer group, but yeah, both. So the same circle for mental health looks very, very different. We have lots of blue, and you won't be surprised by any of this, but special educational needs, chronic illness, communication difficulties were real risk factor for mental ill health or psychopathology. Above average cognitive ability was a protective factor. Here, high family income is a protective factor. Perceived socioeconomic status didn't have any effect for psychopathology, so that really just impacted well-being. And then lots of red again, so arguing with parents, problem getting along with peers, but very little purple compared to the previous slide. So the effect of like school and neighborhood was much lower on mental ill health than it was on well-being. So to just sort of put all of that together, that's my favorite infographic. It took hours to get to this point. So you have to appreciate the effort that's gone to try to make this very complicated data accessible. So essentially, the headline is, when you look at the correlates of mental ill health and well-being, what you get straight away is that the correlates that are common, so in the middle of the Venn diagram to mental ill health and well-being, are fewer than the correlates that are unique to each of them, right? So there's more things on the outsides of the circles than in the middle in the shared area. And even in the middle, there's some things that have a very similar effect on both these outcomes. So you can see that bullied by siblings, growing up in a single-parent family, has similar effect on your mental ill health and well-being. However, some other things like arguing with their parents, engaged with school, for example, has a much higher protective association with well-being, a smaller one with mental ill health. And then you have lots of blue on the mental health side and lots of purple, lots more purple and green on just the well-being side. I will leave that on like for 30 seconds so you can look at it. So moving on to how well-being and mental health changes over time, especially through the school transition. This is data from Understanding Society, which is another large household panel study in the UK. And what we see here is for mental ill health, there's sort of a peak at the end of primary school, and then it sort of starts increasing again in secondary school. However, for well-being, that's what happens. So until the end of primary school, well-being is fairly high, and then it really, year on year, dramatically drops. I don't have data beyond age 15 yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if that kept dropping a little bit more. And we looked at the similar things in the Millennium Cohort. So here we're just comparing age 11 to 14. So young person reported well-being. At 11, the mean score was 35. At 14, it was 32. However, for mental ill health, the overall mean score, this parent reported, just slightly increased. But the other thing that's really interesting is stability. Mental ill health was quite stable from age 11 to 14, so our stability coefficient is 0.6. So there are changes, but it doesn't change as much as well-being. Well-being, just between 11 and 14, really, there's very little continuity in the scores between 11 and 14, suggesting it's interesting to figure out why and what parts of well-being are changing, but it also highlights an opportunity for sort of intervention, because if this is not very stable, because in adulthood, well-being is known to be quite stable. And if it's not stable in the early years of adolescence between primary and secondary school, this is a real opportunity to think about what we can do in those first few years of secondary school to sort of maintain children's well-being and not let it drop that dramatically. And looking at the predictors, this is the most complicated graph I have. I haven't found a way of making it pretty yet. But essentially, a few things to highlight was what we found in terms of the mental ill health development between 11 and 14 was that as a predictor of change, so not just static levels of 14 or 11 that we already saw, for girls, family income or socioeconomic status was a predictor, but for boys it wasn't, of changing symptoms, suggesting that for this great increase in girls that we see between 11 and 14, there is a particular sort of risk associated with sort of family deprivation that is separate from just the association that they already had at age 11. So this increasing symptoms also has this particular vulnerability for girls from poorer families. And liking school was a very particular protective factor. And you can see that it was a protective factor for both boys and girls, but it was significantly better predictive factor for girls than it was for boys. So again, in this time where depressive symptoms are really increasing in girls between 11 and 14, it suggests that school connectedness is, again, a particularly good protective factor for girls. I don't know what I've done. Where's back? Okay. So the last sort of empirical thing I'm going to present is looking at how, in the face of certain risk factors, protective factors can sort of mitigate their impact on the development of symptoms. This is not a British study. This is data from the German longitudinal study of child mental health. And here we have development of depression in adolescents. And the risk factor we looked at was maternal depression. But looking at the change, so this depression slope is how symptoms develop. So this is where children started, and this is how sort of the symptoms developed over time. And we looked at various different protective factors. And the idea was to try and pick protective factors from different domains of their life. So we have self-efficacy, which is sort of about the individual. We have family climate. And we have social support that was focused on support available to them in the community and school. And what is really sort of promising about these findings is, in the face of sort of high levels of maternal depression, which we know is a risk factor for increasing symptoms, which you can see by that dark line there. The one there. Increasing or social support, positive family climate, and self-efficacy or development of self-efficacy protect the young person from developing depressive symptoms. So it's quite nice to see in data that supportive things can mitigate the impact of well-established risk factors in the development of symptoms. So just to sort of summarize, what are all these data telling us? Mental health of young people is a rising concern, with a greater number of children experiencing psychological distress. There are non-malleable and malleable risk and protective factors that we can investigate in these large studies. Mental ill health and well-being are not two sides of the same coin, and focusing on promoting well-being is also important. And school climate and connectedness consistently identified as a positive correlate of mental health, so both of well-being but also as a protective factor for mental ill health in school-age children. Just to sort of end, this was a large study we did across Europe, 10 countries, 10 European countries, looking at, this was in 2014, so these data are not super recent, but they're not too old. So we surveyed hundreds of schools in each country. So this is schools' responses. And 60% of surveyed schools in the UK report that mental health and well-being of their students is a high priority in their schools. And at first, when I present that, people always go, only 60%? Surely by now it's sort of more. If it helps to know, in comparison to our European counterparts, we are sort of, as schools in the UK are concerned about mental ill health of their students more than most other countries in Europe. Not suggesting that means we should stop, but just sort of to say that, even though it's only 60%, it is sort of promising comparison. And we also investigated barriers to school-based mental health support. I mean, if you're really interested in the data, we have data on what professionals, what types of interventions, whether they had more reactive or targeted approaches and universal approaches. And this is where the data comes. So in most European countries, and this is not just what we were doing, but most schools said their approaches were reactive, that they worried about treatment after children develop problems. But also, if you look at the barriers, the largest barriers to provision are things like staff capacity, funding, and what is the third one? Specialists available. And so just sort of to highlight in the context of this green paper and things that, there are several barriers to providing all the support we want to support. And I think there are data to recognize that as well. So data are not only useful to understand the level of problems, but data also useful to be able to sort of go, look, these are serious barriers. Even if we prioritized it, these are the things that stop us from doing as much as we could. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Praveetha. Have you got any questions at all?
Yeah.
Do you think that there's a bit of unconscious bias in that more boys are likely to access support because the way they're presenting? Do you think there's a bit of unconscious bias in the system that because boys are likely to present with challenging behaviour, they're more likely to access sort of pastoral support, whereas girls, because they might have more significant emotional problems, but they're quieter, they're not being referred because they may be sitting quietly in the back of the classroom?
Yeah, we actually have, so from the data set that I presented, the sort of key stage change data, because that was baseline, we looked at that particular problem, and with that particular intervention, it was called targeted mental health in schools. It happened quite a few years ago now. But the model there was local authorities and schools were given resources, but not necessarily, they didn't have to do specific manualized interventions. And when you look at also how the schools spent that money, it was primarily spent for interventions that would support behavioral problems. And the idea is that in the context of teaching, the disruptive students are the ones the teachers notice because they're the ones who are disrupting your class, and the quiet girls who might be miserable, but they're not sort of disrupting your lesson. So yeah, so we have data to actually support that, so we know that that's the case. And if you want that reference, you can send me an email, I'll send it to you.
I was really interested in the graphic which showed from the Millennium Cohort study, which showed the depressive symptoms in girls and how that peaked at not the first quintile as perhaps I might have anticipated, but at the is a real peak at like the second quintile and then, high at the third quintile. So I guess I was just interested in kind of, is there a sort of protective factors, or is there more support at the first quintile, or how might you account for that anomaly, I suppose?
It's a little bit of it. So it's not very low in the first quintile. So it is still the second highest after the second quintile. But
I think it's second, third, isn't it? And
yes.
then it's first is the third.
Part of it is explained away by ethnicity differences. So I didn't present it, but in that particular report, we looked at ethnic differences as well. And minority ethnic groups, and this was again sort of replicated in yesterday's Head Start report, have much lower prevalence of or report much lower prevalence of depressive symptoms, and they're much more likely to belong to the most deprived group. So some of that low prevalence in the most deprived group comes from that group having a higher proportion of minority ethnic groups who report lower symptoms. So when you control for ethnicity and look at that gradient, the gradient becomes more clear.
Thank you very much.